We are live.
Hello, and welcome to Connected Learning TV. We're excited about today's webinar and looking forward to a really important and what we think is a timely discussion. So this is the fourth and final webinar of our May 2015 series titled Equity by Design, a DML 2015 showcase. So if you're watching this, please take a moment to share it with your networks. I'm Craig Watkins, professor in the Moody College of Communication at the University of Texas at Austin, and also a member of the Connected Learning Research Network. I'll be our host for today, and throughout this series on Connected Learning TV, we will be shining a spotlight on topics and also speakers from the 2015 DML Digital Media and Learning Conference that's scheduled to be held in Los Angeles in just a few weeks. The conference theme is Equity by Design. The specific dates are June 11th through 13th. And again, that will be in Los Angeles. You can find the full schedule of events at dml2015.dmlhub.net. And today we have with us, I'm really excited about colleagues that we have here today. We'll be talking with and just having a conversation between myself and Ben Kirshner and Rafi Santo. And we'll be discussing some of our research on the last mile. And talking about both the transition to and barriers to opportunity. And one of the interesting sort of developments in the Connected Learning Research Network is a few years ago we started thinking about this question or this concept of the last mile. And while I think some of us are kind of rethinking that term specifically, there still is sort of wide consensus and interest in sort of understanding how do we connect a lot of the sort of activities that young people are involved in, be it in the informal learning space, formal learning space, to kind of real-world opportunities, both economic opportunities, social opportunities, and we think importantly, civic opportunities as well. And so this will be really kind of the frame for the discussion today, and we think this discussion anticipates a number of themes that will also be kind of spotlighted throughout DML 2015 in just a couple of weeks or so. So today, again, we have with us Ben and Rafi. And before we get started, let me go over just a few quick details just to get us ready for this webinar. To those watching live right now, we welcome your comments and questions either via the Twitter hashtag DML2015, and hashtag Connected Learning, or the Q&A feature that you should see within the video player. We'll do our best to address your questions here in the Google Hangout. So any questions that you might have, observations, insights, certainly please feel free to share those with us. Before we begin, I'd like to give Ben and Rafi both a chance to introduce themselves. Tell us a little bit about who you are, where you're from, and projects and work that you're currently involved in. Ben, you want to start?
Sure. Hello, everybody. Thanks, Craig. Yeah, my name is Ben Kirshner. I'm at the University of Colorado Boulder, based in the School of Education, and I'm faculty director for a center we launched here just in 2014 called CU Engage, Center for Community-Based Learning and Research. Our efforts are to leverage the resources of the university to work collaboratively with community partners to advance kind of research on public questions, and especially issues that impact communities, whether they be access to higher education or energy use, that sort of thing. Really trying to promote collaborations that advance community-based research and learning. And then I also happen to do research about how young people organize to open up opportunities for access to education and other issues that affect them in their everyday lives. And I'm a network advisor for the Connected Learning Research Network. I'll turn it over to you, Rafi.
Thanks, Ben. My name is Rafi Santo, and I'm a doctoral candidate at Indiana University and the project co-lead for something called the Hive Research Lab, which is an embedded research partner of the Hive New York City Learning Network, which is a network of, at this point, over 80 informal learning educational organizations, everything from cultural centers and museums and libraries to small nonprofits. And a lot of the work that we do at Hive Research Lab focuses, in two areas. One is around the network dynamics and collaborative kind of practices of these organizations, but also more relevant to the conversation today, the youth interest-driven learning pathways around digital media, things like how the kind of social support they receive allows them to persist in an interest, and the ways that educators can support them as they go on those pathways. So excited to be joining here today. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should also mention Julian Septon Green, who's also a member of the Connected Learning Resource Network and based at the London School of Economics. He was going to join us today, but other obligations prevented him from doing so. But his work is also kind of engaging some of the same kinds of questions that we'll be considering today. And I just want to mention that because I think it's important to note that a lot of the issues that I think we'll sort of grapple with are global in scope, and how do we think about not only the U.S. context, but a broader global world in which we see such rapid transformation happening at a fairly profound level. So Rafi and Ben, I guess one way to perhaps start is to think about the broader kind of social, historical, and economic context, which really sort of shapes a lot of the issues that we're kind of looking to engage here today. And specifically, right, this is kind of a reference to this kind of transition that we're seeing in the broader economy. And this is a transition, of course, that's been in the making for several decades, but this decisive shift from a more industrial sort of goods-producing economy to what many might refer to as a kind of post-industrial kind of information knowledge-driven kind of economy. And with that, of course, has come not only kind of occupational change in terms of the kinds of structured forms of opportunity that are available to young people, but certainly, the rise of what some might refer to as sort of precarious labor, the degree to which work is becoming much more flexible, less long-term, less economically predictable. And so in that sense, young people face a world increasingly marked by uncertainty. And with this comes, striking degrees of social and economic inequality. And if you pay attention to the news, a lot of the research that's coming out, a lot of the reporting that's coming out, there is kind of increasing evidence, right, that young people are facing not only difficult economic circumstances, but in particular young people who find themselves on the social and economic kind of civic edges are facing enormous kinds of structured forms of inequality that I think make the work that's happening in DML and beyond increasingly timely and urgent today. So as we think about this broader context, this context of uncertainty, this context of precarity, I'm wondering, Ben and Rafi, how do these issues sort of look to you on the ground in terms of the organizations, the communities, and young people that you're working with?
I'll get us started, Rafi, and then, but we don't always need to follow this order. So in general today, I think I'll be speaking from just two different research perspectives, or the perspective of two different research projects I'm involved with. One is very much focused on youth civic involvement and youth organizing for social change, and the other is more explicitly focused on new media, arts, and digital media. But when it comes to the civic domain, this context of inequality, in my view, is very much driving much of the kind of the youth activism that we see, particularly in communities of color. And one way I like to think about it is that young people, and particularly low-income young people of color in the United States, since that's really where I've done most of my work, face two contradictions that fuel the activism and organizing. One contradiction is that there's readily available kind of, and very people understanding the importance of kind of education in this knowledge economy, and frankly, a certain level of kind of sermonizing from the political elites that, people need to finish high school and go to college, and that's kind of how young people are expected to fulfill their civic duty. That combined with the lack of access to higher education, and frankly the lack of access to high quality, one contradiction that motivates a great deal of activism by young people in the United States, whether that's an effort to dismantle the school to jail track in their schools, or an effort to create higher quality access to college, and more inclusive access to college. So that's a big one. And then the second one that I'll just mention briefly is what I often think of as a developmental contradiction, which is to say that if we're talking about young people, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, who are capable of, developmentally really capable of critically interpreting their world and really sharing ideas about how to make it better, but really lack opportunities to have a voice, whether it's in their schools or in their cities and communities. There's just a great deal of age segregation that we see, and that contradiction as well between the readiness and interest in sort of participating in decisions that affect my life, but the lack of kind of integration to those decision-making structures is a second contradiction. And that's how I think about this issue a lot when it comes to political activism.
Yeah, and in my mind, there's a number of really big trends that are important to pay attention to here. One has been well documented, even going back almost numerous decades. And that's something that Jim G., Glinda Hall, and Kevin Leander called the phenomenon of fast capitalism, which we are so embedded in that we often can't even see it. And that's a lot of things related to kind of the decline of stable work conditions, the rise of what may be called the precariat that Craig mentioned of unstable positions of employment, and an increasing kind of pressure on individuals to see their work lives as being kind of more entrepreneurial, which in certain respects might be seen as positive, but in a lot of respects is actually about responding to the pressures of organizations no longer supporting people to have lives that give them agency by providing economic stability. And speaking to Ben Rather's point on contradictions, which of course as a scholar, contradictions are where it's at. There is an interesting thing within the DML space, when we're talking about this phenomenon of the last mile, of the of potentially interpreting the work within the digital media and learning field and the connected learning kind of framework as being about connecting young people to, say, jobs in tech fields. And DML has always been broader than that. The strong focus on civic engagement and on ethics and on new literacies that are really about cultural participation and civic participation rather than just about workforce readiness, which is really the contrast of DML to something like the Partnership for 21st Century Skills, which was very industry-led. Kind of leaves us in this weird place where you think about kids engaging in things like game design programs or in video production programs and after school or what have you, and then you look at these actual industries and things like the tech industry and especially the gaming industry have in that case terrible labor practices where they really focus on precarious work, and the tech industry is rife with inequality both from a gender perspective as well as from a race and class perspective. So there is this really kind of rough cultural landscape in which we're working when we think about the issue of equity and access to opportunity within these realms.
No, I think those are both excellent and important points, and things I think that we should certainly build upon. And I agree with you both, and Rafi, your last point, that this discussion, as we attempt to kind of frame and articulate it, I think we are very mindful. I think the DML community and researchers and practitioners are very careful not approach just from that sector or even that approach, but understanding that what we're trying to get at here in terms of how do we help young people to develop the requisite skills and disposition to really navigate effectively this kind of uncertainty that they're facing is really about more than simply preparing them to get a job that exists today that we all know is not likely to exist tomorrow. And so the context and the conditions, I think, sort of frame this conversation, you need to certainly keep that. With that, let me, so one of the things that we oftentimes hear about today, right, is that, young people need skills, right, and that, in order to transition into this world, in order to transition from school to work or from school to post-secondary education, that there are certain skills that are required. And just sort of thinking about, your respective work with different youth organizations, with this network of communities, Rafi, that are part of the Hive network in New York City, reflect. What kinds of skills do you think young people should be developing as the world of work and opportunity continue to be transformed?
One place I can start off, just based on research that Dixie Chang, my co-lead at Hive Research Lab, and my research partner have been engaging in around youth pathways, in terms of skills, which I think, skills and dispositions of young people that I think is important to think about. I'll sort of talk in two areas. One is related to just general, research that's been done on social support and community psychology, and the second that's a little more tied to the kind of digital context that we work in. That first space of understanding social support is, we really take a perspective that long-term, what we're trying to do is not just connect youth to particular opportunities, whether it's a program or internship or a job or college, but really to enrich their social networks, increase their social capital, have them develop a rich base of social support upon which they can reliably draw when the inevitable kind of precariousness of the social context kind of comes to bear. And one of the things that's challenging in that is that youth, especially from marginalized backgrounds, have very different ways of thinking about getting help and orienting towards networks of support. So a social psychologist named Barnes, who kind of really talks about this kind of help-seeking orientation and network orientation, that certain kids will just naturally gravitate to getting access to resources through people that they know. And a lot of kids from under-resourced communities are just not naturally modeled that all the time, or if they are often finding that they have social networks that are good for helping them get low-wage temporary jobs, and because that's who's in their social network. And so I think like cultivating a sense of that network orientation and that help-seeking orientation amongst youth is really important. A second thing that I think is really neat that we're finding in our research on youth pathways and with digital media especially, is that the kind of openly networked nature of these technologies and the production-centered nature of these practices means that there's this interesting phenomenon of artifacts playing this important role in unlocking opportunities. So a film that a young person makes and puts on YouTube is then accessed by someone older or even a peer who's like, hey, I didn't know you did filmmaking. And suddenly the youth might even not really have thought of themselves as a filmmaker per se, but suddenly they get positioned by others, that kind of what they call interactive positioning, and then they suddenly have this reflective position, like, oh, I am a filmmaker, and then those artifacts serve to enforce identities that open up opportunities, very much in a similar way as in professional careers that we have as adults. That particular, say, papers we put out there or presentations we make serve as sort of calling cards. And I think that phenomenon of digital technology and production-oriented technology leading to these artifacts that have these weird legs that potentially open up opportunities and reinforce identities, I think is an important thing to pay attention to here. And to have you actually understand that is an important skill, to know how to use those to open up opportunity.
Yeah. If I could real quickly, and then Ben, we want to hear from you. Rafi, something that you mentioned that I kind of noted here, which I find kind of striking, provocative, and eye-opening, is when we tend to think of social capital. We tend to think of social capital, and rightly so, I think, as an asset or as a resource, right? And social capital and networks become the channels and the circuits to which we gain access to, information, objects, resources that we otherwise might not have access to, and that of course, right, is the value of social capital, of social networks. But talk, but also, or at least the cultivation of social capital as a skill, right? And how do we help young people to kind of cultivate, this repertoire of skills and proficiencies that help them to grow and diversify their social capital. And I would just add that, in the work that we did in some of the local schools here in the Austin metropolitan area, in one school in particular, one of our sort of major takeaways, right, was that we thought the issue of social capital was absolutely critical, right, to sort of understanding block pathways to opportunity beyond the things that kids had access to while they were in school, in high school in particular. And so in this sense, but we didn't see students in our study, right, and these are typically low-income students, primarily Latino and African-American, in some cases coming from immigrant households. We didn't see them as lacking social capital or lacking an interest in investing in social capital, but rather what we saw, right, was perhaps what we might call maybe a lack of diversity within the social networks and social capital that they were cultivating. And some of that has to do, right, with kind of social and spatial isolation, sort of the geography of where their communities and schools were located, and how those geographies and spaces in some ways kind of structure and facilitate the kinds of networks and the kinds of resources that one might be able to access. So, but I like this idea of thinking of the cultivation of social capital as a skill that we certainly should be thinking about as we look forward and look forward to how do we begin to help develop pathways, spaces, and environments that help support young people's ability to connect their learning to real world opportunity. I'm sorry, Ben, to have cut you off.
Yeah, this is really generative. So we've talked a bit about social capital, and I think I'd like to introduce another skill, for lack of a better term, particularly when it comes to this metaphor of pathways, which is being able to make visible the domain, or kind of grasp and envision what the domain is that one is on a pathway towards. And I think that one thing that's, I think one reason why we've struggled with the last mile as a metaphor, and we've also, I think there's advantages and disadvantages to the metaphor of pathways, but one thing that's interesting about this notion of pathways is that some pathways we don't really, as you've already said with precarity and fast capitalism, they're sort of still being built, right? So in new media arts, for example, there's not a clear endpoint that's highly stabilized in terms of trajectories in video production or new media participation. Certainly we know of some occupations, but it's a kind of highly dynamic field. So in that sense, the kind of pathway doesn't totally hold up. We've had a kind of an accidental but quite fortunate opportunity with the research we've been doing with the Connected Learning Network, where we worked with young people from 4 different sites that were all in different ways characterized as connected learning youth programs. But as it just turned out, some of them had two of them had a strong STEM focus in terms of what they were promoting with young people, and 2 of them had more of a new media arts focus. And one of the differences that we saw in the participatory research we did with young people from both sites is that, not surprisingly, when they did interviews, we didn't do the interviews, but when youth researchers asked questions about both opportunities and barriers along pathways, the STEM respondents and participants in these STEM programs were able to articulate, even though there were also barriers in the STEM context, they were kind of able to articulate what the domain looked like, what they kind of needed to do in order to pursue these interests in science. Obviously, they were highly mediated by access to higher ed, but not just higher ed, but lab experience and apprenticeships. And when it came to the new media arts programs, which were just as high quality, I mean, these were really outstanding places for young people to be developing, music recording, videography, and other kinds of skills. The interviews they did around trying to understand what those pathways look like were just there's much less specificity. And it wasn't because the interviewees were somehow less knowledgeable, it was because the domain itself is less clear. And I think Julian Sefton Green, who you mentioned before, has done some nice research about how aspirations are just linked to how visible the domain is. So to answer your question and kind of come back to this question about skills, I think there's something about, I mean, partly it's the domain itself, but this idea of being able to kind of grasp or map a trajectory in a domain is a pretty important one, particularly when we're talking about new media.
Yeah, one thing I'd add to that that's interesting is that I'm kind of going back to this question of what's the right metaphor, which I think we've had a lot of good productive debate around the idea of the last mile or pathways or trajectories in some cases, all of which are laden with a lot of meaning. I really like Chris Gutierrez's frame of role transformation. That what we're really aiming for is to have youth be prepared to continually transform their roles in relation to society as society is changing, which points also to this point that you're bringing up, Ben, about the kind of fluid nature of the fields themselves. And really, again, I often like not to overly look at my own experience, because it is very rarefied in a lot of respects, but more the kind of when I look at just professionals, what professionals are constantly doing, it's not like they hit the last mile and they're done. But what professionals are constantly doing is going through a process of paying attention to the field, paying attention to their own learning, their own transformation, their own interests, where they see problems, where they see opportunities, how they see institutions shifting, and being able to transform their role in relation to that in an ongoing way. And that's a highly dynamic process, and one that, from a maybe skills or dispositions perspective, does kind of speak back to this idea of, I hate this word entrepreneurism, but somewhat of an assumption that you're not going to be finding something and be done at any point in one's life, and that process of continual role transformation, not just individually, but of transforming the communities we're connected to, and maybe this can connect into some of what Ben's looked into on the civic side, that you're engaged in that process of collective transformation as well. What's a collective way of orienting towards these questions?
We got a comment from a listener, just a reference that was recommended that we want to encourage people to check out, called The Social Structured World by Marina Gorbis at the Institute of the Future. So we just wanted to share some of the commentary we're seeing coming to us in the Q&A.
Yeah, and Rafi, I like your last point. So we've been, my team here in Austin, for the last year and a half or so, we've been doing a lot of sort of miniature ethnographies, looking at young millennials, 20 to 28-year-olds roughly, and really sort of turn that into the spectrum. What it's like to sort of transition into this world of precarity, this world of fast capitalism. And one of the things that we're sort of taking away from at least some of the preliminary analysis that we're doing, and which sort of renders the idea of the last mile somewhat not as helpful as it might otherwise be, is that there is this sort of constant need now to continually upgrade your skills. And we hear a lot, right, about lifelong learning, and some of this can become very abstract. It can become, very academic. But in the real world, right, it has real practical outcomes and requires real practical kinds of skills and dispositions in terms of what it means to be both, what I would consider to be both a flexible earner and also a flexible learner. And what there is this constant pressure to always, be upgrading your skills, learning new skills, being able to transition from one job to the next, one project to the next, indeed one organization to the next, right? Because this idea of sort of long-term secure employment, with one organization or with one company is in many respects, right, becoming of a kind of bygone era. And what it suggests, right, is that it requires a whole distinct kind of disposition in terms of how a generation is beginning to kind of grapple with that reality. and what it means in terms of developing, right, both a range of skills, but also a set of dispositions that position one to really be able to effectively navigate, that degree and level of precarity. So, so I really like the points that you both have made in this regard. So Ben, I know that you've mentioned this a couple of times. You've been working with sort of youth-based civic groups, and Rafi, you've been working with what I think are probably some youth-based civic groups, but certainly a lot of kind of education and learning based kinds of groups that are working with young people. And so as we sort of as we continue to think about what it is that young people need, right, to sort of grapple with this world of uncertainty, I think we have each kind of agreed that it's also important to think about what the adults in their lives need, right, from the perspective of an educator, from the perspective of an educational organization or a youth civic organization. So maybe we could spend a little bit of time perhaps thinking about just the kinds of support that teachers, educators, civic practitioners need in terms of helping support young people to link their learning, their interests, their passions, their aspirations to real-world opportunity. And I thought maybe you could each perhaps draw from an experience or two or an anecdote or two from your own encounters, your own research, your own expertise that might help us think about this a little bit.
Sure. So one of the things that we've seen in our research from the Hive Learning Network here in New York City is you have these amazing organizations and often incredibly talented and highly connected teaching artists or informal science educators or youth social justice facilitators that as part of their day-to-day work just are constantly just putting new opportunities in front of their young people. Kids in their programs, or a kid that has finished with their program, but they know that that kid was really super interested in creative coding with e-textiles, and they're like, oh, I heard about this fellowship at IBM, and you should totally take it up, and it's great. And they're constantly in this process of what we call in our research brokering future learning opportunities, which we see as a subset of kind of mentorship practices, and in some respects, it's a ubiquitous practice. This idea of bridging youth to something new, but in another respect, it's something that is not formalized as a practice, and that there aren't necessarily strong social and institutional supports for if I'm a teaching artist or I'm an educator. And one of the things I could say is that. To begin with, not every teaching artist or educator, or a teacher, a classroom teacher, sees their role as being about brokering future learning opportunities. Often they think of their role as preparing youth for future learning opportunities, or as being about knowledge building or teaching. I'm going to teach this kid how to code, or I'm going to teach them about scientific inquiry. But that question of how do you have an educator rethink their role as not just being about knowledge building or preparing for future learning opportunities, but actually being that node of social capital that actually bridges and brokers. That is in some ways an unformalized area in one respect. So there's a lot that we don't know, and hopefully Ben can shed light on some of this about what does it actually look like, what are the dynamics, what is an effect, once we even have it on our agenda, what are effective practices there, and what is it contingent upon? And a lot of what we assume in our research and from what we've seen in the field is a trusting relationship. You need to have a trusting relationship between an adult and a young person in order for brokering to be effective. You need to have adults that know what the interests of youth are, and youth that trust those adults, so they're willing to take up an opportunity. And really importantly, need to have a more transparent information ecology around opportunities. This is a big problem we've seen in the Hive network here in New York, and that we're trying to work on, is that you have these amazing organizations and tons of opportunities out there, and maybe it's this particular case in a place like New York or big urban centers that have a lot of learning opportunities around, but it's very, very challenging to have the right information to the right person in the right moment so that they can actually broker that opportunity. And we find these weird supply-demand challenges where you've got programs that are just like waiting to have great youth in them, and then you've got youth that want to have them, but the mechanism through connecting them is not often there. And we've talked a lot about things like, what does a Yelp for future learning opportunities look like, or what is a recommendation engine around, like, oh well, this is coming up in your area and this is coming up in your area. So we've been trying to think a lot about what are the institutional supports, the educator practices, and maybe even technological solutions around information transparency that might enable this to become a real priority. I'd be curious to hear, Ben, on your side, what you're seeing, because I know you're doing some research directly on this issue as well.
Yeah, I want to pick up on this theme, particularly of brokering and kind of networking. And I would say my general read, my general read on the literature, both in the connected learning literature, but more broadly in the positive youth development and kind of out-of-school time literatures, we as a scholarly community, as a research and practice community, have gotten pretty good at and pretty clear understandings of what quality looks like when we talk about quality program experiences, quality, or social organization of learning, and including trusting relationships, like you were just talking about, Rafi. And what I think we need to do, as frankly, as educators and researchers, so I am answering Craig's question, is attend to some of this active organizing work that happens outside of the context of just providing a quality learning experience in video production or comic book creation or whatever it is. So one of those terms that I think is a really helpful one is brokering. I would also call people's attention to a really nice article by Kevin O'Connor and Annie Allen that looks at they kind of use a metaphor of learning at both ends of a trajectory. So a lot of the times, the way we think about learning as educators is kind of mastering the particular domain or craft that we're looking at. But they do a case example of a poetry slam, an organization that engages young people in poetry slams and Slam Academy, and the active work that the program leaders and educators there are doing to kind of create an actual trajectory in this field and to create a way of being and a sort of public identity as a poet. And so that being a high-quality educator in this context is not just about providing a compelling kind of learning experience for young people, but actually doing active work to create opportunities for young people to leverage those learning experiences for future experiences within a community of poets, etc. So I like that imagery of kind of learning at both ends, or organizing at both ends of the trajectory, meaning you're trying to kind of inculcate novices into an experience, but also really doing work to once people move out of that novice status and become skilled in a domain, linking them to subsequent opportunity. Brokering would be one example of that. In some cases, you're actively producing occupations or roles or modeling new professions. And that kind of field building and trajectory building is something I don't think we've adequately kind of understood empirically or theoretically. And therefore, it's also pretty absent, I think, in our ways of thinking about evaluation, which I think still mostly look at questions of internal program quality or maybe some kind of long-term outcomes. But I really think this is a project for both people embedded in practice and researchers to really try to understand this area of all this kind of active organizing work that's happening outside of the particular program experience.
Ben, I love that you brought up this example of these capstone events, kind of end of program, big public displays. This is something that has been a regular feature of the youth development world for a very long time, especially as kind of the youth media movement kind of broke out, where youth are producing artifacts and films and video games, what have you, and obviously you want to show those off in some way. What is media production without audience, right? And one of the things that we are seeing is really, really important is how do we take so those capstone opportunities do a number of things and could do more. One of the things they do is that they position young people publicly with both the artifacts and the practices related to particular domains, and so they're seen as, again, that interactive positioning, and again, you see themselves as that reflective positioning of their identity as belonging or being linked to those practice-oriented domains. The other thing that we see them the potential for them to do more is very strategically designing these capstone events to be direct opportunities for brokering. So I'll give an example, which is about to happen here in New York in 2 days, an event called Emoticon, which is the New York City annual Youth Media and Technology Festival. And it's an end-of-year capstone event that is open to youth digital media and technology organizations from across the city. And there's all of these organizations that participate, and their youth come, and they share their work, and there's prizes, and there's professionals from these different fields that they network with, and really, really powerful event. Hundreds of kids and professionals that join. And one of the things we're working on right now is a little bit of a design experiment is how could we actually take that context and really explicitly think about where are the moments in that day where you can actually get directly connected to a summer opportunity, because it's coming at this really critical juncture in between when a program ends, when a year-long program ends, and when summer begins, and often youth are hanging out and don't have opportunities. And so, where can we weave in through things like opportunity tables and adults that are going around kind of like with little cards where you can kind of sign up like, hey, I'm interested in X and this program is here and Y. Like, it's very small stuff, small routines that you can integrate in capstone events like this, as well as into the end of programs, formal programs, where you can have these opportunities for adult youth interactions where they actually are putting opportunities in front of young people.
So we have a question from Twitter, which is directed to Rafi, and Ben certainly feel free to respond if you'd like. Here's the question to you, Rafi. So your note about brokering as being both ubiquitous and not formalized in institutions. And so the question is, how can K through 12 teachers be supported as connected learning brokers?
I think I'd mostly repeat a couple of things that I'd said. One is, again, we need to have educators see themselves as brokers. The second is that we need to create a solution for this problem of transparency of opportunities, empower the educators with the opportunities that are out there in a given area as well as knowledge domain that they can put in front of the young people. And the third area is a little bit of a research practice question, which is we need to learn more about what the actual practices are that are effective, what those routines, those pedagogical routines look like. In areas of within program, we've gotten quite good of like, what does it look like for youth to get good feedback on their artifacts? Like, we've learned a lot about that in the context of our program. We don't know a lot about what good practice routines are for this actual act of brokering and when it actually is successful or when it's not. And I know that Ben also has some examples from this.
Yeah.
So real quick, we've seen this in some cases when it's linked for K-12 teachers, particularly at the secondary level, when it's linked to like a senior paper or senior project. Sometimes high schools will have that as a graduation requirement. And there's the Tar River Writing Project has done some interesting work in North Carolina where teachers are doing some of that brokering through something called Project Connect that people might be interested in checking out. I know that in Oakland Unified, Ellen Middaugh and Joe Kahn and others there have been doing some work with senior projects related to civic engagement and civic learning that is also kind of designed around some of this brokering. So I'm not fully answering the question, but I do think we're starting to see some examples where there's a greater hybridity, meaning kind of the school walls are the design is to bridge school and out of school and do some of that brokering to where the community institutions are.
Yeah, this makes me think about the year that we spent in a local area high school, and again, that school was predominantly populated by kind of middle to low income students from kind of resource constrained families and communities. And one of the things that I think struck us about the school in particular was some of the work that we did with some of the technology teachers who in fact saw themselves as brokers, right? Who in fact sort of deliberately took on that role as a node in their students' sort of learning in social ecology that was sort of a unique opportunity to link those students to other kinds of resources, other kinds of institutional agents, that weren't necessarily a part of the school. And And I wonder to what extent, there are a few things that come to mind for me. I wonder to what extent, this is becoming something that more and more teachers and perhaps even more administrators in schools are beginning to think about, right, as we open up our idea of what learning and the future of learning might look like. So this idea of schools being kind of very enclosed, very insular, very kind of disconnected from the outside world, to what extent do we see some slight evidence that kind of ethos might be, reversing in some important way? And then I think for our work, we're also kind of pondering, how do schools, and not necessarily teachers, not like an individual teacher or maybe even a community of teachers, but how do schools and school districts see themselves, right, as brokering institutions? In other words, right, perhaps even rethinking what their role and position is within a respective community, and how these issues are particularly urgent, right, and kind of resource-constrained communities, resource-constrained schools, where the activities of brokering, sort of making connections or connecting students to outside and external agents and resources in more affluent schools may be just a part of how they do business, right? It's simply how they operate and how they see themselves in their roles, and to what extent, might we begin to develop an ethos, a culture, and a sort of institutional framework that begins to help a greater diversity of schools begin to sort of undertake these kinds of efforts on a much broader scale.
And I just would love to amplify that, Craig, both for schools and for different kinds of youth development organizations outside of school. That, again, I really do think we've spent, maybe the last 10 or 15 years really getting a lot smarter collectively about how to design and implement a really high quality learning program, even though it doesn't mean we always do it, but I think we have some good resources there, but we have not yet really imagined this other piece, and I like how you're suggesting that it really be central to what the task is or what the enterprise is as an educator and as an educational institution, is to really be making brokering not just the thing you do at the end of the day, but somehow designed into the plan. I think that's a new task for us.
I think this kind of leads into an area that we plan on touching on around policy and things that are beyond the level of individual educator practice or kind of youth engagement. And there's a couple of examples, again from here in New York, of how schools have kind of come to think of themselves as brokering institutions. A very famous example is a place called City as School, and City as School actually has relationships with handfuls of community-based organizations, museums, and art centers, and youth development organizations, where they're utilizing in the course of their coursework all of these community organizations as part and parcel of the school experience. Another example is an initiative called Digital Ready, out of the Office of Post-Secondary Readiness here in the New York City Department of Education. And Digital Ready does has a whole host of initiatives around digital learning and personalized learning. But one of the things that they have a really strong focus on is what they call ELOs, extended learning opportunities, and how do they create a system where their schools that are participating in the Digital Ready initiative, which is a small pilot, how do those schools get formalized relationships to community-based organizations that can be kind of ongoing? And I think the real one of the weird kind of tensions, and maybe a weird thing that will push schools, unfortunately in some ways, to think of themselves as brokers, is that with things like access to the arts during the school day, even physical activity, recess being cut, gym being cut, that you're probably going to start seeing initiatives also combine this with the kind of move towards competency-based education, and maybe the dreaded B word of badges, where you start to have a situation where schools are starting to maybe recognize learning that they're not able to provide in their own context, accredit it, through high-quality programming that they recognize is happening at a place like maybe a YMCA when it comes to physical activity, or an arts organization that does something that is very connected to media production and writing, where they can start to have students receive credit for those things, and in the process of doing so, they're actually increasing youth social capital and the access to various networks across a given environment and a given city or region. And I think that's, it's a tension because we don't want to promote more, cuts to the arts and things like phys ed or, civic opportunities in schools. But in a certain respect, the way those cuts are intersecting with the move towards competency-based and maybe towards ideas around micro-credentialing, you can see a little bit of a convergence here about how these institutions might move to a brokering kind of orientation.
Yeah, we have a question that's also come from someone who's listening and watching in, and again, thank you for these questions. This is awesome. Let me ask the question, and perhaps we can sort of think about it, but I think in some ways the question is sort of related to how we wanted to end this conversation, right, which was just sort of speculating about the different kinds of policy sort of initiatives and interventions, both in formal and informal settings, that might begin either to equip institutions and educators and educational organizations to be more effective in linking young people to opportunity, and likewise helping young people to kind of cultivate the skills and dispositions that are increasingly required in this world and economy of uncertainty. So the question is this: can you all share some strategies for how people, educators, researchers, even those in policy, can create the conditions for more equitable engagement and practice across various domains and settings? And again, I think this is somewhat related to the kind of note that we wanted to end on, and that was sort of maybe looking forward and sort of asking, what can decision makers, institutions do to perhaps foster environments and pathways that really facilitate these kinds of opportunities that we're discussing.
Well, I'll go ahead and speak up and share one example. I've been speaking from two perspectives. One, again, the youth organizing kind of field, and then the other, the digital media and learning, and they often come together. But coming out of the youth organizing context, youth organizing and activism context, Sean Ginwright, who's at San Francisco State, had a great paper on building a leadership pipeline of young people of color and social justice activists, because the youth organizing community has been really asking itself some of these same questions about pathways as this DML community has been. And the two areas are in many ways have a lot of similarities in that they're not highly stabilized kind of occupational fields, but there's a lot of young people who kind of getting excited, getting mobilized, highly skilled, highly trained, coming out of high school or coming out of high school age, and who are looking at ways of continuing those pathways. Again, whether it's in kind of political organizing or using new media arts or some combination of both, which we see quite a lot of also. And I just want to mention one example, and then I'll turn it over to my colleagues. But in that political organizing area, there has been some intentional efforts to really build partnerships with higher education, both community colleges and four-year colleges. And there's a group called the Community Learning Pathways that Sean Ginwright highlights in his report. Again, that's called Community Learning Pathways, that is really trying to create certificate programs and or different kinds of training programs that specifically focus on community organizing and recognize it as an actual field that has a kind of professional quality to it. And that work that they're doing is really, again, about field building, about building the road, building the pathway as young people are kind of finding their way into it.
Yeah, one thing I'd say, on this general question of like, how do we move sort of everyone into a position where we can, have these conditions for equitable engagement across settings. And that key word of across settings is kind of the nut that we're cracking here. Every setting is oriented towards its own. When you get into like organizational theory, you get into questions of like, how does the organization reproduce itself? Basically, how does it stay alive and stay relevant? And these questions of how do you have an organization that's focused not on its own setting, but on other settings, in some ways is complicated from an organizational theory perspective. But this is where we get into the possibilities of collective impact work and kind of a lot of work that's happened in the civic space around collective impact, as well as going back to what Ben was saying about youth organizing and actually things like youth participatory action research. You can envision a city-scale ecosystem in which many organizations, including schools, including social service organizations, including informal learning organizations, are working together with this vision towards collective impact of creating these very strong ecologies where handoffs and lane changes and are just like constant. It's the norm. How do you actually ensure that that's relevant? You actually have young people that are also involved in this collective impact work through mechanisms, methodologies from youth participatory action research, and effectively you can think of it as a mass civic organizing where whole cities and all stakeholders can kind of come together. And I can say this is not easy work, it's not an easy vision by any means, but I think one of the reasons that I'm so interested in the work of Hive Learning Networks in New York and increasingly nationally and globally is that they do represent these not the only but a model for these kinds of collective impact networks where you can mobilize a whole range of stakeholders and actors to get to this point of organization where brokering future opportunities can become a lot more viable through coordinated action. And it's not easy, but I think it's a really worthwhile goal for us to hold as a field to figure out what it means to do this, and then also to bring in, like, okay, we actually have to ask questions and research about all the practices. And I think some of the work that has been happening from Tony Bright, Luis Gomez, Paula Mayhew, and a couple of others on what they call networked improvement communities, where it takes a real approach of principled inquiry and kind of using improvement science to have mass communities that are massively mobilized in collective action orientation, have shared measurement across all of them, where you can start to identify very quickly what's working and what's not, adapt practices from one network to another network, and you have this accelerated learning environment. So anyway, I think that I packed in a lot there, but I think that there's a vision that's possible for us to move towards that involves everyone, allowing us to have more equitable access across settings for learning opportunities.
Ben, do you have any final thoughts on this or other kind of related questions?
I'm really excited that DML is really focusing our attention on this question of pathways and where we head as we develop these kinds of expertise and skills. And I look forward to keeping up this conversation at the conference in LA in a couple of weeks. Thanks, Rafi, and thanks, Craig. It's really been a great conversation.
Yeah, no, I've taken like 2 pages of notes here, and absolutely plan to go back and listen to what you two had to say, not necessarily what I had to say. But no, this is quite generative, and I do anticipate that there will be panels, sessions. I know my team in Austin is planning on doing a workshop at DML kind of around these questions, and it's really about trying to bring together people to have this type of conversation, right? And how do we really begin to sort of think about cultivating new approaches, new paradigms, new dispositions, new insights, expertise to really tackle this question, which I think is perhaps one of the most urgent ones of our time. And I think DML is just so poised and positioned to be able to contribute in a very important way to what will certainly be a kind of a critical national and even global conversation as these issues only begin to accelerate in a time of uncertainty. Let me say again, thank you, Ben and Rafi, for a very, I think, rich and enlightening, conversation here. That is, again, part of just kind of kickstarting a lot of the things that we anticipate happening at DML in a couple of weeks or so. Let me also say that there will be a full video recording of this webinar available immediately on www.connectedlearning.tv. And with other curated content and the way in which you can share this with your networks. Finally, let me add that this wraps up the 4th and final webinar of this May 2015 series highlighting themes from the DML 2015 conference. But please absolutely feel free to keep the energy going on. Twitter using the hashtag DML 2015 and hashtag Connected Learning. You can also follow Ben. His Twitter handle and also Rafi's Twitter handle are there on screen. And you can also follow the Twitter handle of the Connected Learning Alliance as well. If you found this conversation helpful, please share it with your network. And if you would like to know more about upcoming webinars from Connected Learning TV in 2015, please visit us at www.connectedlearning.tv and sign up for the email newsletter. Thanks again, everyone, and we're absolutely looking forward to continuing this conversation and seeing some of you in Los Angeles in just a couple of weeks. Have a great day.
Thanks so much, Craig.